What if I told you there was a single photograph that Vladimir Putin never wanted the world to see? Not because it was classified, but because it was human. A photo that, if exposed, could unravel not just a secret mission, but a piece of his past he buried decades ago. Tonight, we're not talking about politics. We're talking about the man before the myth. What if the coldest figure in global power once burned with something real? And what if someone kept a piece of that fire locked away, until now? He never expected to be recognized. Not there. Not then. Not by her. It was 1988. Leningrad. The air outside the train station reeked of coal, vodka, and melting snow. A familiar smell, one that told you exactly where in the Soviet food chain you stood. Putin stepped off the platform with a thin leather folder under his arm. His hair still combed back in that neat, forgettable KGB fashion. Everything about him, his coat, his posture, even his briefcase, was designed to disappear into the crowd. But she saw him. She shouldn't have been there. Not in that part of the city. Not on that day. Yet somehow, fate, or maybe miscalculation, had her walking past the entrance just as he stepped out. Anna Markova. Former linguistics student. A name he trained himself to forget. She didn't stop. Didn't gasp or wave or cry. She simply turned her head, eyes locking onto his for less than 2 seconds. Then she walked away. But it was enough. For a moment, his breath caught, not out of fear, but memory. And that was the real threat. Because in the world he lived in, memories were liabilities. And she was the kind that didn't fade. That night, back at the flat, he stared at the single photo he still kept of her. It was small, faded. A passport-sized snapshot from university. One where she wasn't even smiling. Just looking. He burned it. Not because he had to. Not because anyone told him to. But because he remembered something his first handler once said. If a photograph can make your hand tremble, it's not a photo. It's a weakness. The next day, he filed an anonymous internal request to track her movements. Just in case. He never told anyone. Not even years later, when someone from the archives approached him with a strange problem. A black and white photo had surfaced. Taken by accident, supposedly. Outside a train station in Leningrad. 1988. In it, a man in a Soviet coat and briefcase exits the station. A woman, mid-step, catches him in profile. The archivist had asked, innocently enough, "Is this you, Comrade Putin?" He said no. Calmly. Without hesitation, 2 days after the photo resurfaced, a woman named Irina, part of Putin's private archival staff, was reassigned to Murmansk. It wasn't a demotion. But it wasn't not a punishment either. She never mentioned the photo again. Inside the Kremlin, silence is often louder than orders. And Putin had mastered that silence, weaponized it. He never needed to explain. A look, a pause, the absence of a name on a meeting list, those were his sentences. But the photograph had stirred something. Not in the public. Not yet. In him. He had built an empire on control. Every narrative, every image, every memory, curated like museum artifacts behind glass. But this image, this stupid, accidental snapshot, had slipped through the cracks. Worse, it had survived. That night, he didn't sleep. He went to his private study, a dim room beneath the western wing of the dacha outside Moscow. He didn't turn on the lights. Just sat in the armchair, fingers steepled, eyes on the dark wood of the floor. In his mind, the photo played again. Not as an image, but as a moment. The cold air. The wet soles of his shoes. The weight of the folder under his arm. Her eyes. Why had she been there? He had no record of Anna Markova beyond 1985. Last traced to a teaching job in Tbilisi. Then gone. No marriage certificate. No obituaries. No foreign visas. Just absence. In KGB terms, that was noise. Static. A file that hadn't mattered enough to keep clean. But it mattered now. Because if she was alive in 1988, and someone had caught that moment, then who else had seen? He called Sergei, an old friend from the Leningrad days. Retired now. Living in a villa in Sochi, pretending to care about olive trees and grandchildren. "Do you remember Anna?" Putin asked. There was a pause on the line. Then laughter. "I remember you chasing her through every hallway at the university," Sergei said. "She was too smart for you." Putin didn't laugh. Putin hadn't been to Dresden in over 2 decades. But the city hadn't forgotten him. The archive was buried beneath the museum, accessible only through a side corridor that didn't appear on any public map. It smelled of paper, rust, and time. The kind of place built to be forgotten, yet somehow preserved by the stubbornness of history. He walked in alone. No security detail. No aides. Just him and a memory pulling at the edges of his control. The clerk didn't recognize him. "Good." She handed him a worn file. "Special request," she said in German. "Old deposit. French press archive. Marked confidential. No copies." Putin didn't respond. He just opened it. Inside were 6 photographs. Black and white. Slightly warped from humidity. The first showed a street near the Elbe River. Snow. Empty storefronts. The second, a car, his car, parked near a newspaper stand. The third, Anna. She was standing across the street, facing the lens. A scarf tied around her neck. One gloved hand raised, as if caught mid-wave. Or mid-warning. The fourth, him. Younger. Barely 35. In uniform but not in posture. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at her. The 5th and 6th were unclear. Blurred. The photographer must have moved too fast. Shapes. Motion. No faces. He stared at the 3rd photo the longest. It had been raining that day. He remembered the umbrella snapping in the wind. Her laughing at his frustration. The way she'd said, "You don't get to control everything, Volodya." She was right. And wrong. Because now, 35 years later, he was standing here, in a sealed room in a foreign city, holding proof that someone else had seen. Had watched. Had captured. And yet, she was gone. Still. Again. He flipped the file over. There was a name scratched on the cardboard edge. A. Markova, 1988. For review. Not for publication. Below it, in different handwriting. Too close to... The room was cold. Not physically, but emotionally. Putin sat across from Sergei Medved, a man he hadn't seen in 17 years. The last time they'd spoken, it had ended with a slammed door and a veiled threat. Now, Sergei had asked for the meeting. He hadn't even used official channels, just a handwritten note delivered through a third party in Vienna. "There's something we never talked about. Meet me. It's time." Most letters like that would have been ignored. Or intercepted. But not this one. Because Sergei was the only other man alive who had ever held the original copy of the photograph. Back in the 90s, they were both in transition, Russia was changing, and so were they. Putin was climbing. Sergei was drifting. But one night, after too many vodkas and too few reassurances, Sergei had taken the photograph out of his drawer and said, This is the real him. Not the speeches. Not the medals. Putin never forgave him for that. And Sergei had vanished not long after. Now here they were. In a safe house buried under a Moscow suburb, far from cameras, eyes, and any trace of the 21st century. You came, Sergei said, pouring tea as if nothing had passed between them. Putin didn't answer. He just watched him. Measured his eyes. Looked for tremors in the hands. Still steady. Still calculating. I kept my copy, Sergei said, sliding a small box across the table. Inside, a microfilm reel. Putin raised an eyebrow. Why? Insurance, Sergei replied. You think I'm here to harm you? No, Sergei said. I think you're here because you're finally scared of the past. Putin didn't flinch. But his silence deepened. The girl in the photo, Sergei continued, she wasn't random. She wasn't just some Western contact. She was important. To you. That made her important to others. Be careful, Putin said quietly. Sergei leaned back. I don't need to be. I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. I've got nothing left to lose. The words landed hard. Not out of sympathy, but because it meant the conversation had no brakes. No boundaries. I watched you rise. It wasn't over. Putin knew that the moment he stepped out of Sergei's safe house. The snow had softened Moscow, muffled the chaos, but something inside him felt louder than ever. Unfinished. He returned to the Kremlin not as a leader, but as a man haunted. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in his study, lights dimmed, hands clasped, and the microfilm still in his pocket. He hadn't developed it yet. He didn't need to. The image was already burned into his mind. Not the whole photo. Just the eyes. Hers. The girl from the Baltic assignment. The girl who, for one strange season of his life, had seen him not as an agent or a weapon, but as a person. They'd met in Tallinn in 1988. She was a linguistics student. Fluent in Russian, German, and trouble. His mission was to surveil foreign students suspected of political subversion. She wasn't even the target. But she noticed him first. The first conversation was awkward. The second, less so. By the third, he was no longer writing reports about her. He was writing excuses not to submit them. It was dangerous. It was reckless. And it was real. He hadn't felt anything that real since. They never slept together. Never made grand declarations. But every time she smiled at him, he felt seen, not as a function of the state, but as a man. Then one day, she vanished. No warning. No goodbye. Just gone. The rumor among his colleagues was that she'd been extracted by Western intelligence. Others said she'd been silenced. He never found out. And he never asked. Because if he had, he would have had to admit that he cared. Now, all these years later, her face had returned. Not in dreams. In microfilm. Captured by someone. Preserved by someone. Maybe the photograph was never meant to be found. Maybe it wasn't about hiding power, but hiding the man behind it. We may never know who took it. Or who kept it safe all these years. But one thing's clear, some moments echo louder in silence than in speeches. If stories like this one make you look twice at history,